flames tearing through the darkness, pipelines rupturing like veins under pressure, and a question that could redefine the future of the Middle East. What happens when a nation's energy lifeline is suddenly set on fire? On March 24th, 2026, in the industrial heartlands of Iran, two cities, Isfahan and Khorramshahr, became the center of a stunning and deeply unsettling escalation. According to Anadolu agency and Iranian state-linked media, coordinated strikes hit critical energy infrastructure, a gas management building and pressure reduction station in Isfahan, and a natural gas pipeline feeding a power plant in Khorramshahr. At first glance, the damage appeared limited. Officials reported no immediate casualties, and power supply in some areas continued. But don't let that fool you, because in modern warfare, the most devastating strikes aren't always the loudest. They're the ones that quietly target the systems that keep a nation alive. And here's where things take a truly astonishing turn. Just hours before these strikes, former US President Donald Trump had publicly announced a 5-day pause on attacks against Iran's energy infrastructure, citing what he called very good and productive conversations. So how did energy facilities end up burning anyway? Was this a breakdown in coordination? A deliberate loophole? Or something far more calculated? Because this wasn't just another airstrike. According to Reuters, markets immediately reacted to the growing threat to energy supply, with oil prices climbing again as fears spread across global markets. And that tells us something critical. This is no longer just a military confrontation. This is a war targeting energy itself. But here's the part most headlines aren't telling you. Why target gas facilities that power cities instead of missile bases or command centers? Why risk triggering a global energy shock at this exact moment? Because behind these bold military moves, there may be a hidden strategy, one that could reshape not just this war, but the entire global energy map. And trust me, when we uncover that strategy later in this video, it may completely change how you see this conflict. Stay with us. Let's slow this down. Because what happened in Isfahan and Khorramshahr wasn't just another headline, it was a turning point. To understand why these strikes matter, we need to go back to late February 2026. That's when the current Iran war erupted, following a dramatic escalation between Iran, Israel, and the United States. In the early days, the battlefield looked familiar. Missile bases, air defense systems, command centers. Classic military targets. Strategic, yes, but predictable. But over the past weeks, something changed. According to multiple reports, including Iranian state-linked Fars news agency, the latest strikes didn't hit military bases at all. Instead, they targeted energy infrastructure, a gas administration building, and a pressure reduction station in Isfahan, along with a pipeline feeding a power plant in Khorramshahr. Now pause for a second. Those are not symbolic targets. Those are systems that keep cities running: electricity, heating, industrial production. When they go down, the impact spreads far beyond the battlefield. And that's exactly what makes this escalation so significant. In Isfahan, the strike reportedly damaged parts of a gas facility responsible for regulating pressure in the distribution network. In simple terms, this is the kind of infrastructure that ensures gas flows safely to homes, factories, and power stations. Damage here doesn't just reduce supply, it risks destabilizing the entire network. Meanwhile, in Khorramshahr, a projectile struck a pipeline directly linked to a power plant. That raises a critical concern: electricity generation. Because in Iran, natural gas isn't just fuel, it's the backbone of the national power grid. Disrupt that supply, and you don't just affect one facility, you risk cascading outages. And this is where things get even more complex. Just one day before these strikes, US leadership had publicly signaled a pause on targeting energy infrastructure, suggesting that diplomatic channels might be opening. But Iranian officials quickly rejected those claims, calling them misleading and denying any negotiations were taking place. So what are we looking at here? A breakdown in communication? A deliberate contradiction between words and actions? Or a coordinated strategy where public messaging and military operations are intentionally out of sync? We don't have a definitive answer yet, but the pattern is becoming clearer. Because this isn't the first time energy has been targeted in this conflict. Just days earlier, airstrikes hit the South Pars gas field, the largest in the world, causing damage to facilities responsible for roughly 12% of Iran's total gas production. Think about that scale for a moment. This is not random targeting. This is systematic pressure. A shift from destroying weapons to disrupting the systems that sustain an entire country. And the consequences are already visible. Iranian authorities have warned about potential disruptions to electricity supply following the latest strikes. Meanwhile, global markets are reacting. Energy traders are watching every development, every explosion, every statement, because when infrastructure becomes a target, uncertainty skyrockets. And uncertainty drives prices, politics, in panic. But here's the key takeaway from everything we've just seen. This conflict is no longer confined to the battlefield. It has expanded into the economic bloodstream of the region. And that raises a much bigger question. If energy is now a target, what comes next? Because the answer to that question won't just affect Iran. It could ripple across the entire global economy. And remember that mystery we opened with? The hidden strategy behind these strikes? We're getting closer to it. But before we reveal it, we need to understand the economic shockwave that's already beginning to spread. Stay with us. Now let's talk about the real battlefield. The one that doesn't show up on satellite images, but hits every country on Earth. Because the moment those facilities in Isfahan and Khorramshahr were struck, the shockwave didn't just stay inside Iran. It moved straight into the global economy. And the first place it showed up? Oil markets. According to Reuters, oil prices surged again as traders reacted to the growing risk of supply disruption, with crude hovering close to the psychological threshold of $100 per barrel. Now that number might not sound dramatic at first, but in energy markets, it's a red line. Cross it and you start triggering inflation, supply chain stress, and political pressure worldwide. But here's the bigger picture. This war has already done something far more dangerous than just raising prices. It has disrupted the very arteries of global energy. The Strait of Hormuz, one of the most critical choke points on Earth, handles roughly 20% of global oil and gas flows. And during this conflict, traffic through that narrow waterway has been severely reduced, in some cases nearly halted. Think about that. 1/5 of the world's energy supply suddenly at risk. That's not a regional problem anymore. That's a global economic emergency. In fact, the International Energy Agency has already described the situation as the greatest global energy security challenge in history. And if you zoom in even closer, the damage becomes even more alarming. Recent strikes on Iran's South Pars gas field, one of the largest on the planet, knocked out around 12% of the country's gas production. That's not just a loss for Iran. That's a shock to regional electricity generation, industrial output, and even exports. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Modern economies don't just run on oil. They run on continuous, uninterrupted energy flow. Break that flow, and everything starts to wobble. Factories slow down, shipping costs spike, food production becomes more expensive. And suddenly, countries thousands of miles away, places that have nothing to do with this conflict, start feeling the pressure. And we're already seeing it. Energy executives have warned that if disruptions last more than just a few months, the impact could become systemic to the global economy, not just a temporary shock. Meanwhile, governments are scrambling. Strategic oil reserves are being released, fuel exports are being restricted, countries are even considering rationing energy consumption. Because when supply becomes uncertain, panic is never far behind. And here's where things get even more dangerous. This isn't just about damage, it's about strategy. Because targeting energy infrastructure does something no missile strike on a military base ever could. It creates long-term pressure. It weakens a nation without direct confrontation. And it forces reactions from the entire global system. This is what analysts call the weaponization of energy. And once that door is opened, it's incredibly hard to close. Because now every pipeline, every refinery, every power plant becomes a potential target. Not just in Iran, but across the entire region. And remember that question we asked at the beginning? Why target energy? We're getting closer to the answer. But here's the twist. What we're seeing on the economic front is only the surface. Because behind this financial shockwave, there's a much bigger geopolitical game unfolding. One that involves not just Iran and Israel, but the world's most powerful nations. And that's where things get truly unpredictable. If you've made it this far, you're already seeing the bigger picture. These aren't just isolated strikes, they're part of a much deeper strategy. So take a second, hit subscribe, and stay with us, because the geopolitical fallout we're about to uncover might be even more explosive than the strikes themselves. If the economic shock was the first wave, what comes next is far more dangerous. Because when missiles hit energy infrastructure, they don't just damage pipelines. They redraw alliances, expose hidden tensions, and force every major power to pick a side or carefully avoid doing so. And that's exactly what we're seeing right now. Let's start with the United States and Israel, the two actors at the center of this conflict. Since February 28, 2026, both countries have coordinated a series of strikes under what analysts describe as a joint campaign targeting Iran's military and strategic infrastructure. But here's the key detail. While the United States signaled a temporary pause on energy targets, Israel has continued its operations independently, launching new strikes on Tehran and other locations. That creates a complex dynamic. On one hand, Washington appears to be opening a diplomatic window. On the other, military pressure is still being applied, just through a different channel. Now ask yourself, is this contradiction or coordination? Because in geopolitics, mixed signals are often part of the strategy. Now let's zoom out. Russia has taken a sharply critical stance, condemning the strikes as extremely dangerous and warning of irreversible consequences if escalation continues. At the same time, intelligence reports suggest Moscow has quietly supported Iran with surveillance data and strategic awareness without directly entering the conflict. That's a classic great power move. Support your partner, but avoid direct war. China, meanwhile, is playing a different game. Beijing has urged all sides to stop military action, warning that the conflict could spiral into a vicious cycle that threatens global stability and economic growth. And there's a reason for that. China depends heavily on energy imports from the Middle East, and any disruption, especially in the Strait of Hormuz, could ripple straight into its economy. So what does China do? It stays neutral, publicly calls for peace, and quietly works to protect its strategic interests. Now look at Europe. According to multiple international analyses, European governments are deeply concerned, not just about security, but about energy supply. Many have called for restraint on both sides, fearing that a prolonged conflict could destabilize the region and trigger another energy crisis. And then there's the Middle East itself. Countries like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar are watching this situation with growing anxiety because they sit right in the blast radius of escalation. Iran has already signaled that if pressure continues, energy facilities across the Gulf could become targets. And if that happens, this conflict won't stay contained. It will expand. Because here's the reality. The Middle East is not just a battlefield. It's the center of the global energy system. And any shift in power here sends shockwaves everywhere else. Now step back and look at the bigger picture. What we're seeing is not just the war between Iran and Israel, or even a US-Iran confrontation. This is a multi-layered geopolitical chessboard. The US balancing military pressure and diplomacy, Israel pursuing its own security strategy, Russia and China pushing back, carefully, indirectly, regional powers preparing for the worst. And in the middle of all this, a single miscalculation could trigger something much larger, a regional war, a global economic crisis, or both. And remember the question we've been building toward. Why target energy? Because when you understand the geopolitical stakes, the answer starts to come into focus. But we're not there yet. Because before we reveal that final piece, we need to look at the human and military reality on the ground. What does this kind of strategy actually do to a country and its people? Stay with us. Let's step away from strategy maps and oil charts for a moment and look at what this kind of warfare actually means on the ground. Because when energy infrastructure is hit, the impact is not confined to military calculations. It spreads directly into people's daily lives. And that's where the real story begins. Modern warfare has always evolved. But one of the most concerning shifts in this conflict is the move toward targeting dual-use infrastructure. These are facilities that may support a country's economy or logistics, but are also deeply tied to civilian survival. Gas facilities, power plants, pipelines. Destroy them, and you don't just weaken a government. You disrupt hospitals, water systems, transportation, entire cities. According to the United Nations Human Rights Office, attacks across the region have already affected essential civilian infrastructure, including energy and even water systems, creating what officials warn could become dire consequences for civilian populations across the region. Now think about what that looks like in practice. A strike hits a gas pipeline. That pipeline feeds a power plant. The power plant supplies electricity to a city. Suddenly that city is dealing with blackouts. Hospitals switch to backup generators. Water pumps stop working. Food storage systems begin to fail. This is what makes energy warfare so uniquely dangerous. It doesn't need to destroy a city outright. It slowly disables the systems that keep people alive, and the humanitarian cost is already rising. Recent reports indicate that thousands of civilian structures have been damaged across Iran since the conflict began, with widespread disruption to daily life. At the same time, human rights organizations are raising alarms. Amnesty International has warned that all sides must refrain from unlawful attacks on energy infrastructure, emphasizing that such strikes risk violating international humanitarian law when civilian harm is foreseeable. And here's where things become legally complex. Under international law, energy infrastructure is not automatically off limits. But, and this is critical, any attack must meet strict conditions. It must provide a clear military advantage. It must avoid excessive harm to civilians. And it must consider long-term humanitarian consequences. Legal experts note that targeting energy systems becomes highly controversial when the civilian impact outweighs the military gain. So when a gas facility that powers entire El Mudun is struck, the line between military necessity and humanitarian risk becomes very thin. Now layer on top of that the escalation dynamic, because once one side begins targeting infrastructure, the other side often responds in kind. We've already seen warnings from Iranian officials suggesting that energy facilities across the Gulf could become targets in retaliation. That creates a dangerous cycle. Strike to retaliation, to escalation, to wider impact. And in that cycle, civilians are almost always the ones who pay the highest price. Not soldiers, not policymakers, but ordinary people trying to live their lives. Families dealing with blackouts, hospitals struggling to function, communities facing uncertainty day after day. And this is where the military logic starts to collide with human reality. Because from a purely strategic perspective, targeting energy infrastructure can be effective. It pressures the economy, it weakens morale, it forces difficult decisions. But from a humanitarian perspective, it's a slow-burning crisis, one that doesn't always make headlines, but can last for years. And here's the uncomfortable truth. The more this conflict shifts toward infrastructure, the harder it becomes to contain, because energy networks are interconnected. Damage in one place spreads outward, across cities, across borders, across entire regions. So when we ask, what does this strategy actually do? The answer is simple and deeply unsettling. It turns everyday life into the battlefield. And that brings us back to the question we've been building towards since the very beginning. Why target energy? We now understand the economic shock. We see the geopolitical stakes, and we feel the human cost. But the final piece of the puzzle, the underlying strategy behind all of this, that's what we're about to uncover next. Stay with us. Now, if you think the strikes on Isfahan and Khorramshahr were isolated incidents, think again. Because when you zoom out and connect the dots, a much bigger and far more deliberate pattern begins to emerge. Let's rewind just a few days. On March 18th, 2026, one of the most critical energy assets on Earth, the South Pars gas field, was struck in a major air attack. This isn't just any facility. It's the largest natural gas field in the world, responsible for roughly 70% of Iran's gas supply and a significant portion of its electricity generation. The damage was immediate and measurable. Production dropped, refineries were forced offline, and global energy markets reacted almost instantly. But what happened next is even more revealing. Iran didn't just absorb the Udar, it responded. According to multiple reports, Iranian forces launched retaliatory strikes targeting energy infrastructure across the Gulf, hitting facilities in countries like Qatar and issuing direct threats against Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Let that sink in. This wasn't a back and forth between two countries anymore. This was the beginning of a regional energy war. And the timeline tells us everything. March 2nd, drone attack targets Saudi Arabia's Ras Tanura refinery, one of the largest in the world, causing temporary shutdowns and oil price spikes. March 7th, a desalination plant in Keshem Island is reportedly hit, disrupting water supply to 30 villages. March 13th, U.S. strikes Karg Island, destroying military targets but deliberately avoiding oil infrastructure. For now. March 18th, South Pars gas field is attacked, marking a turning point. March 24th, Isfahan and Khorramshahr, energy systems once again in the crosshairs. Do you see it? At first, energy infrastructure was avoided. Then it became a warning. Then a target. And now, it's a strategy. This is escalation, but not the kind most people expect. It's not about bigger explosions or more troops. It's about choosing targets that hurt the most over time. And that's what connects all these events. Because every strike we've just listed shares one common objective: disrupt the systems that keep a nation functioning. Apply pressure without full-scale invasion. Force strategic decisions through economic and civilian strain. Even analysts have begun to describe this as a shift towards systematic targeting of energy infrastructure rather than isolated military actions. And once you see that pattern, the strikes on Isfahan and Khorramshahr stop looking like isolated incidents. They become the next move in a much larger game. A game where pipelines are just as important as missiles, where power plants matter as much as air bases, and where the battlefield extends far beyond the front lines. But here's the most important question. If this is a coordinated strategy, what is the end goal? Is it to cripple Iran's economy, force political concessions, or reshape the entire balance of power in the Middle East? We've followed the timeline, we've connected the events, we've uncovered the pattern, and now we're ready to answer the biggest question of all, the hidden strategy behind this war. Stay with us, because what comes next changes everything. Now it's time to close the loop. We've seen the flames in Isfahan. We've followed the strikes across pipelines and power plants. We've tracked the economic shock, the geopolitical tension, the human cost. So here's the question we've been building toward this entire time. Why target energy? The answer is both simple and deeply unsettling. Because this isn't just about destroying infrastructure. It's about controlling the lifeblood of a nation, and by extension, the world. According to strategic analyses from institutions like CSIS, early in the conflict, energy facilities were not the primary targets. But as the war evolved, they became increasingly central, suggesting a deliberate shift toward long-term economic pressure rather than short-term military gains. Let that sink in. This is not a war designed to end quickly. This is a war designed to wear down a system. And when you combine everything we've uncovered, the strategy becomes clear. Cripple energy production, disrupt electricity in daily life, trigger economic instability, force political pressure from within. Not through invasion, not through occupation, but through systemic strain. And here's why that matters on a global scale. Because the 2026 Iran war has already been described by the International Energy Agency as the greatest global energy security challenge in history, with disruptions on a scale comparable to, or even worse than, the oil shocks of the 1970s. That means this isn't just about Iran. It's about a world where energy itself becomes a battlefield, where pipelines are targets, where power grids are leverage, where entire economies can be pressured without a single soldier crossing a border. But here's the part that often gets lost in all the analysis. Behind every strategic strike, behind every economic pressure campaign, there are people. Families sitting in the dark during blackouts, hospitals running on backup power, communities facing uncertainty, not for hours, but for weeks, months, maybe longer. And that's the moment where the narrative shifts. Because it's easy to talk about geopolitics. It's easy to analyze strategy. But it's much harder to confront the human reality. That modern warfare is no longer just about defeating an enemy. It's about controlling the conditions people live under. And that raises a difficult, uncomfortable question for all of us watching from the outside. When does strategy cross the line into suffering? When does pressure become punishment? And when energy, the thing that powers homes, hospitals, and daily life, becomes a weapon, who really wins? Because if there's one lesson from everything we've seen in this conflict, it's this. The most advanced weapons, the most sophisticated strategies, the most carefully calculated strikes, none of them are as valuable as the stability that allows ordinary people to live their lives in peace. Not in Iran, not in Israel, not anywhere. And maybe that's the real truth that's been hidden behind all the headlines. Not a secret military plan, not a classified operation, but something far more fundamental. That in a world where energy can be weaponized, the line between battlefield and everyday life disappears. And once that line is gone, everyone is closer to the conflict than they think. So let's bring everything together. In just a matter of days, we've witnessed a dramatic shift. Strikes that once focused on military targets, now hitting gas facilities in Isfahan and pipelines in Khorramshahr. A conflict that once looked regional, now shaking global energy markets and pushing oil prices toward dangerous levels. And a strategy that once relied on firepower, now centered on something far more powerful: energy. Because as we've seen throughout this video, this war is no longer just about territory or military dominance. It's about control. Control over supply, control over infrastructure, control over the systems that keep entire societies functioning. And that's what makes this moment so critical. According to the International Energy Agency, the current crisis may already be more severe than the oil shocks of the 1970s, affecting not just oil, but gas, trade, and global supply chains at a scale rarely seen before. That means what's happening in Iran doesn't stay in Iran. It affects fuel prices in Europe, electricity costs in Asia, economic stability around the world. But beyond all the data, beyond all the strategy, there's something we cannot ignore. Because every time a pipeline is hit, every time a power plant is damaged, it's not just infrastructure that suffers, it's people. Families adjusting to blackouts, hospitals struggling to maintain care, communities caught in the middle of decisions they never made. And that brings us to the most important takeaway of all. In modern warfare, the line between battlefield and everyday life is disappearing. And when that line disappears, the consequences become harder to contain, harder to predict, and far more dangerous. So here's the question I want to leave you with. When energy becomes a weapon, is it a strategic necessity or the beginning of a much larger humanitarian crisis? And do actions like these bring the world closer to stability or push it further toward a conflict no one can control? I want to hear your thoughts. Drop your perspective in the comments below. Because in a world this complex, no single viewpoint has all the answers. And if you found this breakdown helpful, don't forget to subscribe and stay with us for more deep, fact-based analysis of the world's most critical conflicts. Because the story doesn't end here. Not even close.